It's again great to meet you in virtually person. Um, where actually are you now? Are you in San Francisco or are you
Well,
like me?
I'm in Seattle right now. We're not supposed to be doing in-person lessons in San Francisco at the college division. So I figured I'd just hang out in Seattle and here I am. So I'm still teaching my load. We actually start the next semester today, the
Okay,
second semester today. So we're back to the full teaching load this week. Last week was juries.
great.
Mhm.
So let's just kind of start there. Um, Obviously, this 2020 year, the COVID pandemic has changed things dramatically for everybody.
Mhm.
So, kind of talk us through what this looked like for you in terms of how you coped with it. How you go? Take us back to March 2020
Huh.
and your reaction.
I was having just such a lovely time. And all of a sudden, look, the funny thing is I started, this is only my second year at San Francisco Conservatory. So it's all new to me, really. I spent my entire life sitting in a symphony and in a recording studio uh, and private studio. So the San Francisco Conservatory is all new to me. That it's just happened to come at the same time as the pandemic is an unfortunate coincidence. But for me, I'm used to teaching long distance. The FaceTime and Zoom thing, it doesn't bother me too much, except for my eyes, and so I have.
Oh, you have your blue light glasses.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I wear those a lot. And as much as I don't prefer to do this kind of teaching, because there's just a dimension you can't do too much with.
Right.
It's working out just fine. Rather than doing all of my work with just the Zoom, I get a lot of my students to like record their scales and etudes and things like that and send them to me as like on YouTube or something like that.
Uh-huh.
So I can see what they're doing that way because it's actually more reliable probably than just over Zoom, and the
Interesting.
sound is more predictable too. So then we have our studio recitals, and I actually use the chat to tell the kids what I think, the students what I think, and it's working quite well. It's the new normal right now, so it's our lot in life, and we have
Yeah.
to deal with it, right?
So you've been doing FaceTime and that distance learning for a while, you said. How did that?
Well, one of the things, I'm Australian, and you might be able to tell that still. It's been a while since I've lived there, but so I've had students in Australia periodically. I've had them all over the place. Or certainly on the East Coast, and I've had them as far away as Poland and Costa Rica. So
Mhm.
those students can't exactly show up every week. So
Right, right.
for those students, I've done this for a while, but
Okay.
it's still new normal to actually spend the day in front of the computer screen. And,
Right, right. So for a private student, let's say on the East Coast, you said you would have them record their kind of their studies and their scales and stuff, and send it to you. But how about just would you do that as kind of a preliminary, and then the lesson would be that immediate feedback?
um, well, usually the funny thing is most of the time there's the cars and the etudes and things. I actually have the college kids doing that
Hmm.
rather than just the private students. I actually, with the younger kids, I actually go through the scales and etudes with them on Zoom.
Okay.
So it's the college kids because we have limited hours, and I like to be able to separate the technical and the musical. And I think that it's easy to actually comment on merely the technical apparatus of playing and playing in tune, etc. Is I can do that without them actually there, and then just tell
Right.
them what I'm thinking.
Right.
And if there's a problem, then I'll occupy a lesson with it. But if they're proceeding the way I'd like them to, then I'm happy to basically spend the time with them on repertoire, etc. And just leave that scales and etudes to the Zoom, I mean to the YouTube kind
Huh.
of delivery.
Very interesting.
And it's
Okay.
still
So
this is all new too because
yeah.
I'm a real scale guy. I
Okay.
think if you can find just the solution to just about anything in Sevchek and scales.
Yeah.
So I like to actually spend about a third of a lesson on scales and etudes.
Okay. So tell us about what scale system you use, because there's so many out there. Have you kind of developed your own?
I'm actually hoping to publish my scale book. We've been working on it for the last 2 years, kicking the tires and showing it to a couple of my trusted friends,
Yeah.
to proofread it, etc.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm everything from 1 octave scales, 1 string scales, 1 finger scales. I can honestly say that I think, as I say, if you have no other time in the day, practice your scales.
Mm-hmm.
Scales, shifting exercises, string crosses, the things that your signature has to include is
right. Absolutely. So let's just kind of step back and give us a background for those who might not be familiar with your background. It sounds like you've done a lot of orchestra, but just kind of walk us through your kind of development as violinist from way back, as far as you want to go.
Well, let's see. I just always like to share with teachers that my very first violin lesson ever, my parents got the teacher's name from the phone book, and
The violin teacher?
Yes, the violin teacher from the phone book. And now most people don't even remember what phone books are at this point. But they found them. They didn't know anything. My dad was a commercial pilot. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. I went to my first violin lesson after just finishing a football game, and I love to play football. To go to the lesson, and the gentleman who I studied with told me in my very first violin lesson that I had no talent and shouldn't play.
Wow.
And well, that's not the end of that story. But years later, when I actually came back from New York to Melbourne on my summer vacation, I played in the Victorian State Opera Orchestra to make money in the summer. And here's this guy sitting about 3 stands behind me. And I said, "Do you remember me?"
The guy with no talent?
Who are you? Yeah, I said, "You told me." Yeah. So it was a pretty fun moment. But so I started off in Melbourne, Australia, and eventually had lots of good fortune, actually. I had a teacher in the Melbourne Symphony eventually who was a principal player there, who'd studied with an ESCO and DTA at Juilliard, and interestingly, Misha Elman at one point too. Well, you probably know who Joseph Siger is.
Yes.
Joe Siger, of course, was
that's
Elman's accompanist, and
yeah,
we actually became pretty good friends at one point. Joe Siger was a friend of Erick Friedman's,
mm-hmm.
and we have that in common too.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the connection was actually Andre Hadges, this gentleman in Australia.
Huh.
So
this is your first teacher in the Melbourne Symphony.
No, not the first teacher.
We're getting the kind of the primary teacher, the section leader in the Melbourne Symphony.
Right.
Okay.
And
what was his name again?
I'm sorry. Say again.
What was his name again?
His name was Andre Hadges. He was a wonderful fellow. And I actually, through my association with Andre, worked very early on in my life as a session player. I played movies like Mad Max and Crocodile Dundee and a whole bunch of things like that way back when. Breaker Morant, Gallipoli, Peter Weir movies, the Australian things.
Right.
And so I had a lot of studio experience as a kid. So I knew what a click track was. I knew, I learned how to become a professional, keep my mouth shut, and et cetera. And I eventually started playing as an extra in the Melbourne Symphony when I was about 15 or 16. And then, my story coming to the States was Erick Friedman actually was touring, playing with all the Australian orchestras.
Interesting.
And Andre introduced me, and I said, "I'd like to play for you." He said, "Okay."
You said, without your teacher saying, "Hey, maybe you should do this," you're like, "Hey, I'd love to play for you."
You have to make your own opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
So I went and played for Erick Friedman. He says, "Okay, come to New York," and that's basically, I left Australia and went to New York as soon as I got out of high school. I went to Manhattan. Mm-hmm. Only lasted about a year with Erick. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of my time was with Szymon Goldberg,
Mm.
which was wonderful. They were both wonderful in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And straight out of school, I went back to Australia, young married guy at that point, and got a job in the Melbourne Symphony, did more commercial work, and eventually discovered that it was kind of a backward time in Australia still, which is a very forward country, ironically, at this point. But I was sitting in the symphony, and the concertmaster resigned. So there was an opening, and I gave them my resume and said I'd like to apply and audition for the job. 23 at the time, and certainly a well-known quantity to them, having been there since I was about 15.
Mm-hmm.
And they says, look, we're not even going to give you an audition because you're too young. So it was actually the day that I got my tenure, and I said I quit and left.
Wow.
So,
wow.
So I decided, I mean, maybe that was not exactly a rational decision, but nonetheless,
No,
it was my decision. I thought,
Absolutely.
if you guys aren't going to give me an opportunity, I'm out of here.
Well, especially since you had just gotten tenure in the orchestra. I mean,
it seemed I was sitting right up in the front anyway, so it seemed a little bit strange to me. So I then went to England for a while and got a principal job in one of the orchestras there, and wasn't able to take it because I couldn't get a work permit. Back in the old days, the Commonwealth used to mean something. Of course, when England joined the EEC, or wait, they're not there anymore. Thatcher changed everything. So if your great grandparent was British, you could get a passport. Well, so I missed out and came back to the States. Eventually got a job in the Seattle Symphony, which has turned out to be a great thing for me. It's a fine orchestra, a beautiful hall. I mean, so many good things, contracts, good colleagues, etc. And when the Seattle Symphony left the American Federation of Musicians 33 years ago, or something like that at this point, it became obvious that we could actually compete. And so I was the contractor. My colleague here, David Sabie, and I actually were the two contractors of motion pictures and video games, etc., in Seattle for all those years.
Yeah.
So I think people have mixed feelings about that, but the cat is out of the bag. This is an international business, and
you're competing with orchestras who are asking a quarter of the fees.
Well, I mean, it's almost not the fee; it's the back end payments. The big stumbling block, because I mean, Seattle Symphony left the AFM nothing to do with the recording; it had everything to do with how we were being represented. And I just saw an opportunity and went for it. And so, as I say, my colleague David Sabie, who still to this day continues to do it, I quit a while back because I decided,
not for you.
I prefer to teach. I prefer to play.
Of course.
And I had a good run at it. It was fun. And,
well, and it probably taught you something about the music business, I would imagine. I mean,
well, yeah, it did.
Held you in good stead.
What it has taught me is that there are a lot of things missing in the education of young musicians that I had to find out the hard way, like bill collection. They don't teach that in conservatory. Contracts, how to negotiate, etc., etc.
Sure.
That doesn't come in conservatory, and yet it's incredibly important that we learn how to do that as musicians. I think, anyway.
Well, and it's pretty well known that you have, a really great studio, and so you have students who are dealing with contractual issues and stuff. Do you help them with that kind of stuff then?
Well, it's funny. I've actually helped several students with negotiating their symphony contracts when they get jobs, and that's kind of fun because that's something I have some background in doing myself. But most of my contractual negotiation has been with companies like Fox or DreamWorks or something like that, rather than in the music business, until some of my students actually started getting solo jobs, playing with orchestras. And there's not a whole bunch of room for negotiation when you're starting off playing concertos. Sorry, I got something in my eye. So there are fees that are reasonable, there are terms that are reasonable, and we
Sure.
chat them through. And if they're really doable, then we just do it. Because I think any performance with orchestra or recital that's in a series or something like that,
Do
well,
it.
there's
Yeah.
a fee, and yeah, you do it.
Yeah.
You own
Um,
your.
Go ahead. So just talk about how you built your studio from kind of the outset there.
Well, dumb luck has a lot to do with it, to do with my being in teaching at all. My daughters are both violinists, and of course, as a violinist, you'd always look around to get the best teaching for your kids that you possibly can. And I was looking around, and there are just a couple of teachers in Seattle, actually maybe two or three at the time, that were really very excellent. And in fact, Margaret Presley, I believe, is in Colorado now. She's fabulous. And Ron Patterson, who was at the University of Washington, terrific teacher, and Kent Coleman. And I felt that when I listened to the students that each of them played, I liked the style that Kent's students played, and the others are great, of course, but I just was leaning in that direction. So my kids started actually taking lessons with Jan Coleman. And just as they were about to pass to Kent, Kent passed away, sadly. And so, I was talking to Jan and offered to help until they were able to relocate the students. And it was over a summer, and actually really enjoyed myself. It was fun working with the kids that I had. And I said, well, wait a second, Jan. We actually listened to several people came to Seattle to actually audition to take over Kent's studio. And we really didn't feel that any of them was a good fit, and I was enjoying it. So I said, Jan, I think I kind of want to do this myself. This is fun. And if you'll have me, I'd like to give it a go. So it meant that the contracting business that I'd done for more than 20 years became a lot less interesting to me. And it was actually the beginning of my transition out of doing that. Likewise, I think it's important to reinvent yourself as a musician every once in a while, or you get kind of dull.
Yep.
So, I mean, even the symphony became less interesting to me at the time when I started teaching, and that was 15 years ago.
Okay.
Or longer. I'm not really sure what it was at this point.
Sometime in there.
Right now, it's Groundhog Day every day.
Right.
So I'm having a good sense of time. So, I walked into a studio that was actually already going. I didn't build anything. And I don't mind admitting that, because it's still difficult to not ruin something that's working by new and improving it. Ask Coca-Cola when they changed Coke. You remember that? Didn't do any good. So, and in fact, I always remember at Lincoln Center, I used to play in the mostly Mozart orchestra. They decided to new and improve their summer programs, and they shortened mostly Mozart, and then had this new fancy festival that lost them millions of dollars until it actually kind of got on its feet. But and mostly Mozart had worked for so long, 8 weeks, and it was crowded every night, and etc. So I tried basically not to ruin it, and until I got my teaching chops, so to speak. Jan and Kent worked together. Jan, I still think today, is possibly the best early teacher of anybody I've ever seen, period. She starts these little kids off, and she has the patience of a saint, and she has exacting requirements. She's caring, and at the same time she's belligerent. I don't think she'll mind me saying that.
Demanding, maybe.
Yeah, demanding in a very, very pleasant way. But she never gives up on a kid, and I love that about Jan. Jan started the kids off, and then they progressed to Kent, and he was the advanced teacher. And I've kind of taken over that role.
I see. Okay. Well, okay. So I've found that with teaching, there's kind of a 4-year threshold. I don't know if you found that, but what do you feel like is the time perhaps based on what you just kind of described in terms of the progress of a student from teacher to teacher, about when maybe it's time for a student to leave, or is there just a natural progression? Sometimes they just go to college, but sometimes adult learners, you have that. So just kind of address, what is that moment that kind of feels like, well, I think it's time for a new perspective?
Well, I think at a certain point, as soon as they know what you're going to say before you say it, it's possibly it's a signal,
Mm,
and it's different for everybody. Frankly, one of the things that I use a lot of catchphrases, and I don't apologize for that, because if you can actually remember, an approach to actually solving a problem, if it takes a catchphrase or something that sounds kind of cliche, so be it. I do not mind repeating myself. So in my case, I think people know what I'm going to say, and pretty early on. So it's a little different for me, I think.
mm. Well,
There are
what are some examples? Sorry to interrupt you, but what are some examples of the catchphrases you would say?
Well, if you think it's out of tune, it is. Okay,
Right.
just because you can doesn't mean you should. I mean, I've got some kids who can play incredibly fast, and you just say, well, hold on, it actually isn't supposed to be that fast. So so I'll do things like that.
Okay.
You know, fabulous, wonderful, do it again. That's
Okay.
another one.
Okay.
I mean, just things like that. And I have technical requirements that I insist on, especially, as I say, the whole scale approach to getting something clean is very important to me. It's different for every single kid, obviously. I've had Sophie Lee was my student from the age of about 7, and she's 17 right now. She'll be going
Mm.
off to college,
Okay.
probably to if Curtis has an audition this year, I suspect Sophie will get in. So I've had her for a very, very long time, and then I've got students at San Francisco Conservatory. For instance, I've got a professional studies student right now. I'll probably only have him for 1 year,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe 2.
Mm-hmm.
So the time span is different. I think the little guys have a longer shelf life
Mm-hmm.
than the older ones,
Yeah.
and that's okay. I would expect that.
Yeah. Now, what does your load look like? I mean, do you still play in the orchestra? You have your teaching load at the conservatory, and then you still have your private students, I'd imagine.
I actually have officially put in for retirement from the Seattle Symphony. I
Okay.
eventually I left initially on a sabbatical, because after playing in the symphony
How?
for 30 years,
Yeah.
it's kind of a tough cord to cut, if you will.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to be sure that the lifestyle of just teaching was actually going to work for me. And I'm having a great time. It's wonderful. As I say, reinvention is a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
You
Well,
know,
it's
there's
not like you're reinventing yourself every year. I mean, being that there's a tremendous longevity there for 30 years in an orchestra. I mean,
Well, yeah, but your priorities change when you're in the orchestra over a period of time. Because the orchestra is it was one of the things that I did. I mean, the contracting business was huge.
hmm,
I mean, we would, I had months where I'd have 40 sessions with 100 guys
wow.
at each session. And so that was huge. It was more at one point, I think it was actually more of my life than the symphony was. Certainly the symphony was not my highest form of income.
Interesting.
And so, I mean, I was torn in too many directions, and frankly, I was doing too many things.
Yeah.
And I think if you want to get something done, you ask a busy person. That's another cliche line, but it's kind of true. When you get used to being organized,
Yeah.
you can get amazing amounts of things done. And
Yeah.
in business, I hated being told something couldn't be done. I
Mm,
just want to figure out the way to get it done. And when you change your lifestyle, and you're not necessarily the boss of something, as I was in contracting, you find that you have to be more part of the process. And when somebody tells you something can't be done, I'm at San Francisco, I'm listening at this point, because this is all kind of new for me still.
sure.
And because I have to understand academia,
Mm-hmm.
I have to understand that there's a process, blah blah blah, and the way you give out degrees they have to have accreditation, so they've got process, and
Yeah.
there's a reason for stuff. So as I'm learning the ropes, my thinking is changing in a good way. But the symphony was something that became incredibly predictable for me. It's like, on Wednesday you're going to play this, on Friday you're going to play that. Okay,
Sure.
shut up and play.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit different from me.
Now, let's just kind of say how many students do you have like currently?
I have 16 in San Francisco, and let's see. Well, actually, it's 15. I have. I also do some. I have a string quartet that I coach down there as well,
Okay.
and plus the studio class. So my week in San Francisco conservatories, the load is 18 hours. In Seattle, I'm not sure, but it's not as many as I have in San Francisco now.
Okay. So, but what's probably nice is that you haven't had to travel like you used to. I would imagine you were traveling a lot.
Yeah, but it's like if you get in a car in Los Angeles and you go from the south to the north, it takes you as much time as it takes me to get from my house here to San Francisco Conservatory. And I've discovered it's actually not so unusual. I mean, to commute. Okay. This San Francisco Conservatory is a great school. I mean, I'm completely enamored with my gig. I love working with the people down there. And from teaching pre-college that when you teach in pre-college and your students are actually deciding on which schools they want to go to, you've always got that that list of colleges that you always hear coming up. And over the years, those lists change. I always remember, the first thing on the list was Miss DeLay when I was in college. And, Miss DeLay is no longer. And so things change. And I actually think that schools go this way, they go this way, or they go this way. And I'm very pleased to say I think San Francisco's it's just skyrocketing, and it's become a lot more, it has a lot more profile than maybe it has in years gone by, and I'm delighted about that. And certainly when I hear the level of the kids that I've got, it's very good.
Yeah. Now, what are some lessons that you learned from your teachers that you hear yourself saying to your students?
Well, one of the things, I'm a clean freak. I'm extremely insistent on my students actually making string crossings with no junk in the middle if they're going from G to E strings. I don't want to hear the D and the A. You can't say to your audience, sorry folks, I've got to go from here to here, and there are these two strings inconveniently placed between them. No, you can't do that. You have to approach this thing with cleanliness, because when it comes to your audition, you've got two wonderful musicians in the finals for final round for an orchestra job, and one plays clean, one doesn't. Who gets the job?
Yeah.
So this is one of my pet peeves. I hate what I commonly refer to as junk. And I've also from Mr. Goldberg, he was very insistent on not over slurping.
Over what?
Slurping, lots of glissandi all over the place, and
which is interesting, yeah, because his time would have been emerging from that very much. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I mean, he and Erick were like Erick Friedman. The two of them were polar opposites.
Very different, yeah.
And I've from that experience studying with these two wonderful gentlemen who are at the opposite ends of the spectrum, I've learned simply that the guys who say that you should use a shoulder rest, and there are guys who don't say you shouldn't use a shoulder rest, why limit yourself? You could both work. Use all the flat hair, no, only on the side of the hair. Well, actually, the side of the hair from the frog to the balance point, then the flat hair, they're all right.
Yeah.
So there's so many possibilities to do the same thing, and I actually think that limiting your scope of how to play the violin is really a stupid position. Mm-hmm. So I learned that from these two polar opposites.
Yeah.
Right now, I grew up not using a shoulder rest, and now I use one. Mm-hmm. I've played the ring cycle 12 times. I highly recommend use a shoulder rest. I mean, it's easier on your body. it has its ups, it has its downs, but your physicality has a lot to do with your choices.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you wouldn't give a large violin to a small person. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
So I learned that from my teachers. You know, the transportation shift and the nuance shift are not the same thing and shouldn't be approached the same way. I mean, very, very simple and practical things, because ours is not witchcraft. It's physics.
Mm-hmm.
It's physics and mind over matter.
Hmm. So talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about how to be successful in auditions, and you could say, I suppose, similar things too about competitions, but what about the students who work really hard, play really well, and still aren't successful? How do you break that down for them? And sometimes their parents.
I would say to them, I would say to you first that just because they don't win something doesn't mean they're not successful.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually think about competitions as being the end all of our profession, I'd say you're sadly mistaken. From this standpoint, every competition has one winner and a whole bunch of losers. Mm. Now, I don't believe that to be the case. I think that competition is a good thing, because that's life.
Yep.
And that my students, enter a lot of competitions. I think basically it's actually preparing for a career. I don't think that winning is necessarily the point. Mm-hmm. In fact, I have well, my daughter, for instance, is employed, which is great, right? Mm-hmm. She's associate concertmaster in the Minnesota Orchestra. Never won an international competition, but behind the curtain, nobody knows if you have or not. Yeah. So I mean, who's going to have a solo career? It's a very, very limited market. Sure. So, the competition, I think, is great for preparing for a career. Mm-hmm. Great to actually get nervous. Getting nervous is awesome. Yeah, I agree. I'm backstage at the Symphony Hall with one of my students who's just about to walk out and play. It was actually Sophie when she's like 7 years old, in a little cupcake dress and the sparkle in the hair and everything. And she, I feel this tug on my jacket. I look down. Oh, there's Sophie. She says, Mr. James, I'm really feeling nervous. Hmm. I said, that's great news. Yeah. I said, it's great news. You're supposed to be nervous. If you don't care, you're not going to get nervous. Yeah. You want to play an exciting performance, get nervous. Mm-hmm. I also learned from my mother. My mother would come up to me when I'm a kid, and I'd tell my students this, and she'd put her hands on my shoulders and she'd say, Szymon, whatever you do, don't get nervous when you go on stage. I said, Mom, I'm not nervous right now. No, now doesn't matter. When you walk out on stage, don't get nervous then. And it was like, yeah. I look back at that, I think to myself, I love my mother. Yeah. But that particular advice. So I found that, since, it was actually that moment with Sophie backstage that I came to the conclusion nerves are good. They're not something to be avoided. There's something to be embraced. Yeah. So what is your process for kind of preparing a student for those kind of having the nerves be a good thing rather than a... Right. Well, look, I mean, if you walk along the street every day, you don't forget how to walk. Your point's well taken. What you do all the time is what you're going to be fine with. Obviously, the more you perform, the better you get at it. The more you do something, the better you get at it. Mm-hmm. We have recitals every week. Nice. In our studio every week. Great. And before competitions, we'll often have maybe 3 recitals. Wonderful. I can actually remember having 4 on a weekend. Not so uncommon. But it's funny because the Symphony here in Seattle actually has a young artist program, and everyone under the sun will show up to audition for this thing. And I've had about 20 students have actually it's more than 20, that have actually played concertos with the Seattle Symphony over the years, which is great, right? But the thing that strikes me is my colleagues will say to me, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that in the first rehearsal, they dropped nothing. And I said, this is not their first rehearsal. It's your first rehearsal with them. Mm-hmm. They'll show up, and if a kid's playing Tchaikovsky concerto, I guarantee you they will have played it 20 times in recital before they show up to that. Absolutely. And they don't drop notes, and they know their orchestra scores back to front, inside out. Mm-hmm. And I'll get them out on the stage before anybody shows up so they can feel what it's like to have the sound coming back at them,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So I just think that repetition of good behavior, eventually, you have a predictable outcome. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what we practice for, is for a predictable outcome.
absolutely.
So if you only do it the right way, how could it possibly go wrong?
Right. And also I often tell my students, celebrate your mistakes. If you're playing something by memory and you're basically you're putting extra pressure on your preparation, there's going to be some mistakes that happen, and now you know what to work on. I mean, it's like if you're always in that situation where you're comfortable and you never make mistakes, that talk about a cliche when a student comes in and says, oh man, this is so much better when I was practicing by myself. Well, you don't have the pressure, but don't shy away from those mistakes. Those are the golden opportunities. Take advantage of. Now you know what to work on. So
Well, I mean, adversity creates opportunity.
mm-hmm.
The other thing is, the one thing I try and stress to my students is, look, mistakes will happen. That's just a given. What do you do about it? The
Yep.
ones that actually, the students that actually have not got the ability to get over the mistake, it's a downward spiral. As soon as actually, it's like if you take victory and defeat the same way, in competitions, you sleep better. If you make a mistake, it's the best thing that I can teach a kid to do is not make two mistakes.
Yeah.
It's like, the biggest thing is to live in the moment,
Absolutely.
not for something that's gone by, because you can't take it back.
No.
So, I mean, maybe another one of my mantras is, don't make one mistake into more mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Get over it. And what a professional does is they go on, and they also don't share it with their audience.
Yes.
An audience will sit there with white knuckles when they see somebody, going,
Oh yeah,
when
absolutely.
they're playing. The audience is like,
They get
the only
nervous.
person that shows the audience there's a problem is the player.
Yeah.
So you have to put your game face on and get over it.
Well, and trust when people tell you, gosh, I didn't hear anything. They're not just being nice. I think you hear about 50% more than the audience does,
I'm sure
just sitting
for
there.
having your own student playing, where every possible issue is.
Yeah.
So you're almost hypersensitive to the
Yeah.
whole thing. But when you step back and actually, especially if you record a concert and then you listen to it 6 months later,
You're like, wow.
it's pretty good.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how you have had opportunities perhaps to play more solo repertoire, and kind of related to that question, how much do you feel like you need to demonstrate to your students, especially those works that you might not have played? So do you only teach works that you've played so that you can demonstrate? I don't know. That's kind of a big question, but.
Well, I mean, I think there have been a lot of great teachers over the years who've not been able to demonstrate stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you get to my age, and this is a young person's gig. I just have to say it. I do not expect that getting older is going to make your playing better.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I mean, when you're a student, you're not necessarily paying taxes or doing the laundry or driving the kids to whatever.
You just have all this time.
Stuff just changes over the time. I've played certainly just about all of the major orchestra, concerti in the orchestra, not with the orchestra, but in the orchestra. And from my perspective, I think actually the orchestra playing teacher has a massive advantage.
Mm.
One of the major things that I think is good from an orchestra player's perspective, teaching a concerto, is where things go wrong. If the violin soloist does this, there's a problem. And I could go through a litany of places in the repertoire that when the soloist really understands what's going on in the orchestra, they are a better soloist than the ones that just show up and say, "Follow me."
Yeah, absolutely.
For instance, resonance.
Mm.
Resonance is a big factor when you're playing a concerto with an orchestra, because as soon as they hit a very sec kind of staccato chord, it's still in the air for half an hour, right? And that sensation that we all know when you play a concerto with an orchestra, it's like pulling a truck along with your teeth.
Mm.
That's what it feels like. And half the problem is that the anxiety of us actually wanting to move forward, we actually do it in the wrong places.
Mm.
And if you really understand, what's going on in the orchestra part, you will never play a long note too short.
Mm.
because you're rushing. It's not them.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually understanding how the bits work. And the fact is that, for instance, I had a student played a concerto in the Concerthaus Orchestra in Germany. She couldn't watch the conductor at all because the conductor would go,
Boom.
about half an hour after the beat the orchestra plays. Now, these things, the orchestra player understands this. And I think that's a unique position for somebody to actually really feel like what it's like to accompany something, as well as to play with the orchestra.
Very interesting.
So yeah, I'm perfectly happy teaching music that I haven't performed as soloist, but there are precious few major pieces that I haven't accompanied.
Mm.
So from that standpoint, I mean, and I've accompanied them with really good people. That's been the joy of my job in Seattle. Yeah. It's like having all these great soloists. I mean,
absolutely.
Being this far away from Kavakis or Ennis or all these great guys.
Yeah.
Wonderful people too, Hardlick and
that's great.
Et cetera, et cetera. And,
yeah.
And in fact, most of those guys have actually been in my home and taught my studio.
That's great.
Kavakis
what a great opportunity.
He's been a friend for many years. I don't see him all that frequently, but he always comes over. And and I was never shy. I'd go up to people in the orchestra and say, I've got a bunch of students. Would you listen to them? And you'd be stunned how many of them would come over.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you really could not imagine some of the people who have actually just said, yeah, sure, because they're on the road. They've got nothing but time.
Right. Would they rather spend it in their hotel room or yeah. So maybe a pedantic question, but there is the question of quality of instruments. And I remember reading a long time ago, this gives you a sense, when Vengerov won the Flesch competition, I think he was the youngest to ever win it or something at 14. And he had a beater instrument, right, by all accounts. And he did just fine. But what is that moment where you're like, I think because I think I've had parents be like, well, does he need a new instrument? And I'm pretty low maintenance about my instrument, my strings and stuff. But what's your take on that moment when a student needs a new instrument, how much difference it's going to make, and just kind of address that, perhaps even what kind of instrument you play?
Well, I've owned a lot of violins in my life. My first good violin was a Panomo. My second good violin was a Joseph Rocca. I've owned 2 Vioms, and I just bought another Joseph Rocca. Ironically, just not so long ago. But I'm enamored of some of the modern instruments out there. Certainly, it's my opinion that the price point for a modern instrument is considerably more practical than going into debt, because you cannot live in a violin last time I checked.
Right.
I want the violin setup is almost the most important thing. If you have a great bass bow, if you have a good post, you have a good bridge, you have strings and a fingerboard that's shaped correctly and a neck that shapes correctly, and more wood than glue. I think I have Alina Kostina. I have got 3 of her violins. She's amazing. And I always recommend to my students that they consider Alina's violins, and David Gussett's another one. I mean, Joe Curtin, Feng Jiang. I mean, there are a whole bunch of modern makers out there. I think we should all get accustomed to encouraging our students to explore, because just because it's old doesn't mean it's good. I mean, look at me. But I mean, obviously, I mean, as soon as you've played a really great Strat, you know what the difference is. I mean, it's an amazing thing to play a great Strat or Del Jason. I've been very fortunate to play many of them over the years, but nonetheless, I don't think I'm going to be able to afford one anytime soon. So rather than despair, I just as soon actually say, okay, I'm going to get the best I can.
Yeah.
And I think, several price points exist. If you're thinking about an investment, then actually even the modern violins, they're not getting cheap.
They're getting, yeah.
And I'd say
absolutely.
that the price points, I mean, if you compare what you get for $300,000 for an Italian violin and $300,000 for what you get for a French violin, you're going to do much better with a French violin. I mean, these price points, they have their investment, but they're not necessarily playing investment. They're money investment. Two
Yes,
different
and
things.
you need to see it
Completely
like
different.
that. Yeah. So let's close by just talking about a couple, um, memorable moments both in your performance career and in your teaching career. Like I think, honestly, some of my most memorable moments are just seeing my students succeed where they didn't think they could, and just having, so those are really precious moments for me. But let's just talk about, you have obviously two sides to your, I mean, every violinist has kind of multiple sides, but how about a couple memorable times in your performance careers, and memorable times in your lives of your students?
Well, I think that playing the ring cycle was one of the most important things in my life. I got to play the cycle 12 times,
Wow.
which
Oh,
is a couple. And I still fantasize about writing an etude book out of Wagner excerpts called Wagner Size or something like that.
man,
Uh,
I'll tell you
I
those
think that,
things. A lot.
they're treacherous and it's grueling. Um,
And
so
have they all been in Seattle or in different places? Have they all been in Seattle, the ring
yeah,
cycles? Okay.
Seattle Opera.
Okay.
And in my commercial career, I got to work with Elmer Bernstein and
Hmm.
Michael Kamen and Bill Conti and a whole bunch of Michael Giacchino,
Yeah,
a bunch of people like that.
it's
I
really nice.
got to play concerts with Billy Joel and Elton John and
Mhm.
um, huge number of things. And I love that. I'm not a one-trick pony. And I
Yeah.
think actually if I could emphasize one thing to anybody that wants to actually go into the music profession, that it's, you have to have a diverse viewpoint on this thing. If you do anything well, you'll have a good career, you'll be happy. If you set your sights on doing only one thing and consider yourself a failure, if that's not exactly where you end up going,
Mm.
I think that's a sad thing.
Yeah.
I think it's really sad. I mean, I've had a great life. I mean, I'm a very lucky guy, and I just pinch myself every once in a while that everything is just it's been a great career because I've done so many different things. I'm probably a master of none, jack of all trades, but master of none, and I'm good with that. And I
Right.
wish my career for all of my students that you can play the odd concerto recital and do some teaching, play in the studio, get a symphony job,
Oh
play
yeah,
some chamber music, all of the above. Play
I
some
agree.
rock and roll for goodness sake.
Yep.
Why not? You
Yeah.
know, I just think that that my life has been good from the standpoint that I haven't just done one thing. How boring would that be? That
Yeah.
drive me nuts, like being the hamster in the wheel. But highlights, boy, I play in the Australian World Orchestra, and
Mm.
I think that some of the concerts we've done with Muti and Rattle and um, you know Zubin Mehta, some of those concerts have been just completely memorable. Just just hanging out in that group. The Seattle Symphony's been a great thing, and so far as teaching is concerned, I think truly some of the great moments occur when your students win big competitions. It feels pretty good,
Yeah.
Um, and I've had uh, been blessed with several students who have done very, very well in those, and hopefully that hopefully that continues. Who knows? The quality of playing out there is extremely high at this point,
It is.
and it's very exciting.
Well, and
You never expect your students going to win, but you're thrilled when they do, right?
well, I'm glad you kind of put it in that way, that it's exciting that we're really, I feel like we're in a golden age of violin making and instrument making
Certainly.
and playing. I mean, it's just a great time to be a musician and be surrounded by such excellence.
Mhm.
So anyways, I think you're a tremendous contributor to that, and we're all blessed to just kind of hear your thoughts, and I appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure.
So anyways, with that, we'll end. And again, thank you very much. Great to
My
meet you,
pleasure. You too.
even if it's virtually. And hopefully we get to meet in person at some point.
Well, San Francisco Conservatory is sending me, well, they had planned on sending me to Colorado at some point,
Nice.
some kind of recruiting trip. And I intend to get there at some point.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, I'll look forward to meeting you there.
All right. Hey,
Thank you.
nice to meet you.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.